Hello everyone, I'm Ruth and I'm a priest at St Sed's Church, and it's lovely to talk to you today. Now I expect that you're all looking forward to having a couple of weeks off soon. Great, that's great. So this will be your Easter holidays. But what is Easter all about? Is it about, hang on, let's have a think. Is it about eggs? Chocolate? Is it about bunnies? Chicks? A big Easter meal? An Easter egg hunt, maybe? Lots of chocolate. It's got to be about lots of chocolate. And also it's often about families and friends meeting up and celebrating, but we can't really do that this year, so perhaps not so much about that. Well, you know, there's lots of traditions and customs around Easter. There's a Christian aspect as well, which we're going to have a look at now. Now, as a Christian minister, I actually won't be having much of a holiday at this time. In fact, Easter is the busiest time of the year for me, busier even than Christmas, but I do get a bit of time off after Easter Sunday. So why am I so busy? Why? Well, we have lots of services to remind us what happened at Easter and why it's most important event in the Christian year. Now, many of you will know the story of Jesus, some of you won't. But in the next 10 minutes, I'm going to recap on some of the main points of what Easter means in the Christian faith. Well, in actual fact, the story really begins at Christmas, when Jesus was born. So, Jesus grew up, and at the age of about 30, John the Baptist baptised him, and then he went off into the desert. Now, this was to get ready to have a bit of preparation time for what he was about to do. And we remember this time in the desert by having the 6 weeks of Lent, which we're near the end of now. And now during Lent, some people decide to give something up for the 6 weeks. A popular one is for people to give up chocolate. Then after he came back from the desert, Jesus started to teach people all about God. He did a lot of miracles. He healed people and he did things like walking on the water. And this all happened in the country we know today as Israel. Now, lots of people loved Jesus. They got to know him, and they thought what he was saying was so good. And one day, as he was coming into Jerusalem with his disciples, he was riding on a donkey, and everyone was so happy to see him. And they cheered and clapped and waved palm branches. Look, like this. They waved their palm branches. Hooray! Hosanna! 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 And it was just fantastically brilliant time. Great celebration as Jesus came into Jerusalem. Now, when we're at church on a Palm Sunday, we often give out these little crosses. You can see them. And they're to represent palms. They're little palm leaves actually, tied into a cross. And these palm leaves remind us, we take them home and keep them all year, and that reminds us of when Jesus came into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday. Now, some people, they weren't that happy about Jesus being like a celebrity. He was a bit like a celebrity. And these people were the bigwigs who ran the temple. And they thought Jesus was getting a bit more attention than they were themselves, and they just didn't like it. So they were trying to find a reason to arrest him, throw him into jail, just to keep him out of the way. But Jesus knew that they were plotting against him. And the last few days of his life on earth was such a special time. And I'm just going to go through a few things that happened during that time. So he was rather annoyed at all in the temple. People were buying and selling things, and it was like a market, a terrible hubbub. And there was people changing money up and taking money for goods. And the temple should have been a bit like one of our cathedrals, a big holy place. But instead of that, he thought it was being turned into like just a commercial enterprise, bit like Lakeside, if you like, instead of a place of prayer. And he was so angry that he got onto the tables and turned them up on end, and all the money that was on the table all spilled onto the floor. And these are coins you would find in Israel today. These are called shekels, and that's used to represent the sort of things that the people were had on their table and what was spilling onto the floor, all the commercial side of buying and selling in the temple, which Jesus was just so annoyed about. Well, what else happened on those last days? One of his disciples, Judas actually, he agreed to betray Jesus. He said, I'll hand you over to him. And they said, well, okay, that's great, Judas, but, we're going to give you some money for that. And they gave Judas 30 silver coins. And these silver coins are to represent what Judas took to betray Jesus. A terrible thing to do. And then we come to the Last Supper. You've probably heard of the Last Supper. And Jesus did a lovely thing for his disciples. He washed their feet for them. He got a big towel, and he put the towel round his waist. Took a bowl. Actually, it wouldn't have been like this bowl. This is a nice plastic bowl, but it would have been an earthenware bowl or something like that. But he bent down and he washed the feet of the disciples. Now you have to understand that in Israel, it's a very dusty and hot place. And in those days, people would have just worn sandals. So you can imagine how dusty and horrible their feet were. Just awful. Must have smelled awful. But anyway, Jesus went around to all his disciples and washed all their feet for them. A beautiful thing to have done for them. And that was at the Last Supper. And then what else happened? Well, they were all comfortable, feeling all nice and clean. And then they had a meal together, which was a brilliant thing to do. And they must have had a lot of times together, but this was the Last Supper. And so they shared some food. And then at the end of the supper, it sort of went quiet. And Jesus shared some symbolic things with them. So he had some bread. This is not like the bread we have. We have bread with yeast in it, but they had bread without yeast in it. You can see it's quite thin. And Jesus said, "This is my body given for you. This bread is my body given for you." He took a piece of bread, passed it to the next person, who then took a piece of bread, passed it to the next person, and his disciples were the side of him and down the sides until the bread came back. And then he did the same with the cup. This was a cup of wine, and he said, "This is my blood shed for you." He drank some, gave it to the next person, who drank some, gave it to the next person, who drank some, gave it to the next person. Then it came back. And so this represented Jesus' body and his blood. And we do a similar thing today in church. We call it Holy Communion. We usually sometimes have proper bread, or sometimes we have a little wafer, and we have wine. Call it Holy Communion, or we call it the Eucharist. Some churches call it Mass, the body and blood of Jesus. And we actually say the words that Jesus said at the Last Supper. to represent this last meal. Now, after the meal, Jesus and a few of his disciples went to, not very far away, a little garden, olive trees, Garden of Gethsemane, and he prayed. He was really upset and in a state because of what was going to happen to him. And then, not long afterwards, the soldiers came to arrest him, because remember, he'd been betrayed by Judas. Now, Jesus was sentenced to be crucified on a cross, which was not a very nice thing to do. And do you know what? Those soldiers, they couldn't care less about Jesus. They just thought, oh, it's nothing, but it's terrible, terrible death. And they played a game. They had dice, perhaps not as big as these dice, but they several soldiers round, and they played, and whoever got the highest score, they won the beautiful robe that Jesus was wearing. He had this lovely robe round him, all made of one piece, no seams, a very lovely thing, and they just gambled to see who would win the robe. So just didn't really care much what was happening to Jesus. And then Jesus was put on a cross and crucified, and you might have seen pictures of Jesus' hands put out like that, and he was nailed to a cross. Very cruel way of doing it, and there would have been some rather horrible nails, if you can see them, nails that would have been put into his wrists to keep him on the cross. And now here's a cross. Obviously, this is a much smaller cross than Jesus would have been put on. But if you come to our church, you'll see lots of crosses in our church, scattered all round, and it represents what happened to Jesus on Good Friday. In fact, I wear a cross round my neck too, and that's to remind me of Jesus' sacrifice on Good Friday. Now you might think to yourself, well, I don't know, that's funny, isn't it? You call it Good Friday, but something horrible happened. Well, it's more like Bad Friday, really. But the answer is that really it was good for us, because Jesus died for all the stuff that we do wrong. And so that's good news for us. And just a couple of days later, on Easter Sunday, Jesus rose back to life, which was brilliant. And we represent Jesus' life by an egg. Now, if you see a little egg that you might have for breakfast, if you get a fertilised egg, then you get a little chick inside. You may have seen where they peck their way out. You get a fluffy little yellow chick come out of the egg. I just want to reassure you that any of the eggs you buy in the supermarket do not have chicks in, so don't worry about that. But an egg represents new life, and that's why we give chocolate eggs, really nice chocolate eggs. But like my egg, look, it's lovely, isn't it? So our egg is to represent new life. As a Christian, I believe that Jesus died for the things we all do wrong, so we can be forgiven, and that's just great. And I believe that Jesus rose to life 3 days after being crucified, which is great news. So, if you could just remember these two symbols: the cross, Jesus died; the egg, Jesus rose back to life. Good news for all of us. Happy Easter, everyone. Bye-bye.